Hi, today we're going to be talking about the political spectrum. First off, we're going to start on the economic side of things. So here you're looking at the spectrum, and we call that a line from left to right with the idea that someone can be at any one point on the spectrum, that I don't have to be on just this one side, the yellow side or the green side, but I could be slightly yellow and slightly green. I could have both, a little bit of both parts. So starting off, here you'll see we have identified on the right-hand side of the spectrum, so that would be the side on the right, that economic freedom is what we're looking at. And as you move towards the left, we're looking at greater economic control, and that's referring to governmental economic control. So if we start on the right with capitalism, capitalism basically refers to a lack of governmental intervention in the means of production. So when it comes to making money, making products, and the economy, the government doesn't really take too much of a major role. People privately own businesses, and prices are not controlled by the government, but instead it is a supply and demand situation. So if there is a greater supply for something, then companies will create it. The prices will go up when there is lower stock, and they will fall when there is higher stock. You can talk to an economics teacher about the rest of it. The result of this capitalist system is that we tend to have a greater wealth inequality and development of a class system because only a small percentage of the population owns the means of production, and the vast majority of the population is part of the working class. And also with the 20th century, we have the development as well of the middle class. So that's sort of a capitalist system. When we consider the socialist economic system, what comes into play is this greater economic control on the behalf of the government. So what that means is that many basic industries tend to be government owned. So for example, natural resource industries, banking, healthcare, all of these other sorts of industries tend to be directed and owned by the government. In the case of far left economies, we'll see that actually there may be zero private property. So that's sort of the idea here with the economic spectrum. But what we do get on the socialist side of things, it tends to be less inequality and a better likelihood that each person's basic needs are met. And what I mean by that is, for example, healthcare, education, they're paid for more in part by and run by the government. The way that the government does that in a socialist economy is that they take a greater percentage of taxes from the individual citizens. So under a socialist economy, you as a citizen, you have to pay more taxes. Let's say you pay 50% of your salary as taxes, but you receive far more services from the government. In the capitalist system, you may only pay 10% tax, but you will receive far less in the social services department from the government, and you'll have to pay for more of that out of your own pocket. So if we continue along, we will see that this turns into, here, as we see socialism, on the extreme left, this will eventually turn into communism, which you may have heard of before. And then as we move to the darker green, we have our extreme right wing, and eventually we'll look at this will actually be called fascism. But as you can see, under here we have essentially planned economy. Here we have something called welfare capitalism, and this is where Canada fits in. And then here, which you can mostly see, laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire meaning that you just leave it be, that it is what it is. So if we move on to the political part of this, ignore that for a moment, and we look at the political side, we can sort of identify two major political differences here. One being dictatorship, which you may have heard of before, and the other being democracy, which is what we have in Canada. So the idea with a democracy is that people have individual rights and personal freedom to make their own choices about how they live their life and what they do. And they also have political choice, meaning that they get to vote for the leader, and that they can get rid of a leader if that person is not fulfilling their desires when it comes to politics. In a dictatorship, typically instead of individual rights, we have terror and force, which are used to enforce the government position. And instead of personal freedom, we have controlled participation in the system. So you don't get to make all the choices that you might like. You are somewhat forced or held to the expectations of the government or the ruling party. We also typically have a one-party system. This means that you don't have the freedom to choose who you want to be in power, but that whomever is in power is going to be staying in power for the foreseeable future. So that is sort of a democracy versus dictatorship. Now, watch as this goes a little bit crazy. Ooh, we're turning it into a sideways bar so we can put it up against our economic spectrum that we were just looking at. So if you see both ends of the spectrum, the extreme left and the extreme right, as you'll see when I straighten out this line, they're both under a dictatorship style system, whereas the center of the political spectrum tends to be more democratic. So if we straighten out this line and we put our little labels on either side, you'll see what I was talking about. So here we have the left of the spectrum, the right of the spectrum, and then democracy in the center. And as we continue, here are those words that I was mentioning earlier: extreme left wing, extreme right wing, and going one more step further, we have something here on the bottom that is showing the relationship of each of these political options to change. So as we move to the left, we have the governing body typically wants greater social change. So here towards the left, we have a government that wants social change, or we might say it's progressive. Further on the left, we have a more radical government. Here's the labels for you. So radical basically refers to wanting a complete social or political reform. And typically that is a communist system that wants huge changes to the existing, typically capitalist system. So they see the capitalist system, they say, we want big changes. They want radical changes. Okay, and if we flit over to the right-hand side of our spectrum, we have the more conservative group wanting to maintain the status quo. Status quo means what currently exists. So they say, we're not really interested in change. We want it to stay the same. Okay, so they're not interested in making any changes to laws or to society in general, typically. Now, as we move further to the right-hand side of the spectrum into the extreme right wing and fascist style government, we see this word reactionary. And what reactionary is it's actually a desire to return to a previous status quo. So not the existing society, but to one before that, to sort of get back to something that they feel is missing from today's society. So I may feel that as a teacher, back in the day before cell phones and computers, people used to look at the teacher instead of their screens, okay? So that might be my reactionary feeling about current teaching practice, right? So that is the idea of the political spectrum. Now, what happens when we combine the two? So if we have up here our political spectrum and down here our economic spectrum, let's see if I can make this a little bigger for you. There we go. What happens when we combine them? So let's take this slowly. If we separate out our labels here and then start to squish them together, we will see that if we meld them together, you can imagine that this, for example, democratic socialism, there is still political freedom to some extent, but there is a lot more economic control. And as we move further to the left again, we will see even greater governmental control of the economy. And if we go all the way, we'll see that that's actually called communism. And if we go further along the right, we will see that as we get to dictatorial capitalism, we have now the appearance of this word fascism. And when we get to the 1930s in our history class, you will start to talk about that with Hitler and Mussolini. And moving on, there we go. We see all of our labels. Okay, and typically Canada is falling a little bit left of center because we do have some greater socialist policies when it comes to health and education, for example, but we are still a democratic and mainly capitalistic society. So that's kind of where we are about there. Now, putting them together in a different way, if this makes sense, that's great. If not, you can ignore it. But if we look at this and we sort of put the two different political and economic axes together, and we look at, for example, if we have political freedom and economic control, what do we get? So this is where I get to make decisions about who is in power, but they get to make decisions about the economy and how it works, more so than if it was completely capitalist. That would result in democratic socialism. If we look at the next example, where we have political and economic freedom, so that's right here, we have democratic capitalism. Moving on to the next, where we now have a lot of economic freedom, but much greater political control, meaning that you're doing what the government tells you to do in your personal life, more so than in the economic side of things. Then that would be a fascist system. And the last one is if both economic and political systems are very much controlled by the government, then you are in a communist system. And here they all are together. Hopefully, you feel that this has helped you to understand the political spectrum. If you still have questions, check back with us in class.